Bom dia a todos e todas que nos assistem. Hoje nós iniciamos o terceiro e último eixo de debates do Seminário Internacional de Governança da Internet, abordando um tema que se faz tão atual quanto importante, sobre o funcionamento, o poder e a influência das plataformas que atuam na web. Essa iniciativa, que foi proposta pela EGI, a Escola de Governança da Internet, busca pensar de uma forma mais profunda como podemos enfrentar esses desafios e como a governança da internet também pode contribuir nesse sentido. Para esse debate, nós recebemos aqui a Renata Ávila e o Wolfgang Kleinworster. Renata e Wolfgang, agradecemos muito por terem aceitado o nosso convite e eu transmito aqui as saudações especiais do professor Hartmut Glaser, secretário executivo do CGI.br. A Renata é advogada internacional de direitos humanos e escritora. Atualmente é fellow no programa Human Centered Artificial Intelligence do Centro de Estudos Race and Tech da Universidade de Stanford. Com mais de 15 anos de experiência atuando em questões de ponta relacionadas à tecnologia e sociedade, ela foi cofundadora da A+, Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms. Especialista em direitos digitais, seu foco de estudo é em política de dados, transparência e suas implicações no comércio, na democracia e na sociedade, alertando para um fenômeno que descreve como colonialismo digital. Ela é membro do Conselho Consultivo da Creative Commons Open Future and Cities for Digital Rights. E também atua como curadora global da think tank Digital Future Society. Ela é cofundadora e membro do conselho da Progressive International, entre outras funções. O Wolfgang é professor emérito de Política e Regulamentação da Internet na Universidade de Aarhus. Ocupou o cargo de diretoria na ICANN de 2013 a 2015 e foi embaixador especial da iniciativa Net Mundial, em 2014 a 2016. Ele também esteve envolvido desde o início na preparação da Cúpula Mundial da Sociedade da Informação das Nações Unidas e é presidente da Summer School on Internet Governance. E, por fim, também gostaríamos de agradecer muito ao Wagner Diniz, que aceitou moderar este debate. O Wagner é gerente do Centro de Estudos sobre Tecnologias Web, o seu web, no nic.br. Ele trabalhou em governos e organizações não governamentais em diferentes oportunidades, principalmente na identificação de boas práticas de uso da tecnologia e da prestação de serviços. Wagner, muito obrigada por aceitar o nosso convite. A gente deseja uma ótima discussão.
Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Eu que fico muito satisfeito de poder participar com vocês, de ser convidado para essa mesa e estar presente, né, com duas pessoas tão qualificadas como a Renata e o Wolfgang. Para mim é uma honra imensa. Agradeço muito o convite, parabenizo o NIC, parabenizo o CGI por organizar esses seminários que são muito ricos nas suas temáticas e cada vez mais atual, né? Acho que o momento que nós vivemos, né, é um momento tão particular da humanidade e que revela a importância da tecnologia na conexão das pessoas. E na importância da tecnologia também para tornar o mundo mais humano. Muitas vezes isso parece contraditório, mas, no fundo, nós, dessa comunidade cibernética, dessa comunidade que tem a internet como ponto de confluência, para nós a tecnologia tem sido sempre um elemento e uma ferramenta de tornar o mundo cada vez mais humano. A nossa mesa, né, tem o tema Futuro do ciberespaço entre a abertura da web e a plataforma da rede, ou a plataformização da rede. O tema proposto, penso que sugere uma polarização ou pelo menos uma tentativa de encontrar um espaço que fique entre o que seria uma web aberta, como foi proposto originalmente por Tim Berners-Lee, e a web murada, falada por ele também, né, murada, cercada por uma miríade de plataformas que não se conversam. Esse debate está colocado no meio de várias outras discussões, eu penso, discussões essas que estão centradas na governança da internet como um modelo multissetorial que promove a evolução e o uso da internet com princípios, com normas, com procedimentos e programas compartilhados, né? Essa é a definição mais clássica de governança da internet. E esse seminário já promoveu discussões anteriores, e nessas discussões anteriores, né, lembro que no eixo 1 foram levantadas questões, né, relativas à disputa de poder, que são questões, né, que é uma questão central na discussão do multissetorialismo e nos espaços de governança. No eixo 2 desse seminário, né, ficaram muito evidente que nós temos limites atuais para nós conseguirmos chegar a uma internet que seja única, segura e resiliente, né? E essas questões, a questão de poder e os limites que nós temos, certamente são questões que vão alimentar essa nossa discussão agora no eixo 3, porque elas não estão restritas à governança da internet, nem somente restrito à discussão sobre os recursos críticos e a infraestrutura da internet. Questões de poder e os limites atuais que nós enfrentamos para ter uma internet aberta e interoperável, essas questões se espalham pela camada da web e vão, né, para a economia e vão também para a política. A nossa mesa vai se concentrar na relevância e no protagonismo que as plataformas adquiriram e como que essas plataformas hoje, principalmente, né, as plataformas de redes sociais, mas não restritas a elas, como que elas, né, da uma forma como elas estão estabelecidas e o modelo de negócios que ela propõe, como é que elas refletem essas disputas de poder e como que elas eventualmente estão mudando a própria web, né? E até certo ponto estão mudando a sociedade, porque hoje, né, nós temos uma boa parte da sociedade dependente da internet, dependente da web. E vamos ver também se essas plataformas elas acabam impondo limites ao funcionamento da web e aos seus processos de governança. Para ficar mais claro aqui para a nossa audiência, o nosso debate vai ser dividido em 4 blocos, onde no primeiro bloco nossos convidados vão apresentar umas ideias, suas ideias introdutórias para o assunto que nós estamos propondo, e depois vamos passar por um bloco 2, onde nós vamos explorar com um pouco mais de profundidade, né, a experiência dos nossos expositores, porque eles têm uma vivência muito forte na discussão, né, sobre as questões de poder na web, sobre a governança, né, e como que, né, as plataformas podem impactar nessas duas questões. Passaremos, então, para o bloco 3, que é pensar como é que a gente pode construir um cenário futuro para a web. Será que nós podemos construir a web que nós queremos, né? E, finalmente, nós vamos abrir as perguntas, né, e buscar responder as perguntas que a nossa audiência tem. Ok? Vamos passar, então, para o bloco 1, que é um bloco introdutório. E, para esse bloco, eu queria, né, trazer para todos vocês brevíssimas colocações do Tim Berners-Lee, o criador da web, né? E aí eu lembro vocês de que quando o Tim Berners-Lee, lá né, no início, quando ele fez um rascunho, um esboço do que seria a web, né, esse texto, né, seminal, né, ganhou um comentário, né, do seu chefe dizendo que, olha, era uma proposta muito vaga, mas não deixava de ser interessante, empolgante, né? E aquilo que era, né, aparentemente vago, né, acabou se tornando, né, as tecnologias básicas da web, e aí o Tim Berners-Lee criou o que seria o navegador, a base do navegador, que é a linguagem HTML, depois também criou o protocolo de comunicação, HTTP, e o identificador único da web, que são as URLs, né? Essas três tecnologias compõem o coração, né, o centro, né, do que é a web hoje. E o interesse global, por isso, cresceu. E ao contrário do que poderia se esperar com tamanha invenção e crescente interesse, o inventor da web, o Tim Berners-Lee, poderia ter patenteado a sua criação, ou as suas criações, né, e manter isso sobre os seus cuidados e manter um controle sobre ela. Ao contrário disso, o Tim Berners-Lee apresentou o seu trabalho para o mundo e passou a cuidar da sua evolução de uma maneira colaborativa e aberta, né? Essa sua história não é em nada diferente, né, do que foi também a criação da internet muitos anos atrás. Sempre pessoas com uma cabeça mais aberta, com uma consciência mais libertária de que os conhecimentos devem ser compartilhados com todos. Muito bem. Nós estamos em um momento em que a web está se descaracterizando dos seus princípios originais, segundo tem manifestado o próprio Tim Berners-Lee, já há 4 anos seguidos, quando ele faz o seu manifesto via Web Foundation. Esses princípios, né, eles permitiram que as empresas que criaram as plataformas chegassem aonde chegaram hoje. Foi exatamente em cima de princípios abertos que essas plataformas cresceram. Exatamente pela web ser uma plataforma aberta, colaborativa e universal, que nós temos plataformas com tamanho sucesso hoje, né? E elas, no entanto, vão no caminho contrário de se fechar. O Tim Berners-Lee alertou recentemente que a internet poderia se tornar uma série de jardins furados, cada qual com suas regras, o que poderia prejudicar, inclusive, a própria democracia. Eu gostaria, então, que os nossos convidados pudessem fazer a sua introdução, né, pensando exatamente nessa questão mais inicial, né? Será que, da mesma forma que o Tim Berners-Lee pensou e os criadores da internet pensaram, se a internet e as suas aplicações básicas deveriam ser consideradas um bem comum, né? E se os princípios de governança da internet atuais, eles consideram a internet como um bem comum, da mesma forma que a água, a moradia e a saúde. Passo a palavra, então, para a Renata e depois para o Wolfgang, por favor.
Thank you so much. I will do it in English so we have a more fluid dialogue with Wolfgang. It is a pleasure for me to be here. It's an incredible pleasure because when I received this invitation, I was excited because Brazil was precisely that model of the garden. It was precisely one of the places, one of the architects of possibilities in the digital sphere. And I felt, like many of the steps, I followed the steps of many of the people in Brazil who were visionaries on a different digital vision that inspired many people in my generation. It was a time of promises. And, I come from Guatemala. It's one of the most unequal places in the world, but I had the luck of having access to a computer and having access to internet, even if a very precarious internet at a very early moment. And that really transformed my life. I mean, that really transformed, made me live not only physically the country, because that I did it much later, but mentally, and discover a world of possibilities that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And it was in the 90s, it was a very, yes, I am old, it was a very inspiring time. It was the internet of creation. It was the internet of possibilities. It was this boundless space. And that was Brazil in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was a space where digital was equated to freedom, to democracy, to boundless creation, to the possibilities of access to knowledge for all. It was a combination of public infrastructure, the right policies, the right foreign policy as well, and diplomacy, and these digital possibilities that were permitting us to dream a different world. All the time in the early 2000s, I was thinking, oh my God, I wish I was Brazilian. I want to be Brazilian, because for me, it was the most exciting place, from the free software movement, from the to the open education movement, where these possibilities of the internet were like not only, nice stories or nice principles in a book, or the dreams inside the head of Tim Berners-Lee, or something that was just accessible in the global north, but it was a country in the global south and a group of people in the global south, a collective, making it possible. However, it did not scale and it did not age well, sadly. And that's my first point. My first point is the broken promises. If we look at freedom, now we can see that we have an internet of control, and not only control of the individual, but control of entire collectives. If we see the systems deployed against workers, even, tracked every movement, how digital became this cage, even for children, even for reading every gesture, reading every moment, reading every action, and then predicting it, and then penalizing the many just to increase the profits of very few. We realized that the promise of freedom was not met. The promise of democracy we have seen. I was just monitoring 2 elections, more recently the election in Ecuador. And the degree of complexity to preserve the elections free and fair, for example, became radically difficult because of connectivity, because of social networks, because of this architecture that places above everything profit and maximizes engagement rather than strengthening principles of democracy. Then the boundless creation. We are facing the largest monopolies in human history. And we know that monopolies are the principal enemies of creation and innovation. And then access to knowledge and education, sadly, instead of the democratization of knowledge, we are facing this phenomena of the democratization of ignorance, the rapid spread of non-knowledge, of harmful pieces of content that have not legitimacy and that are shaping the behavior of people north and south. We can see it clearly with the vaccines and misinformation, actually. So it was a trap. Those promises and those blue skies were a trap. The second point is we believed back then in the power of the collective. We were like celebrating Creative Commons and the possibility to create and share for free and create big things, big archives of music and films and textbooks and Wikipedia and so on. And we realized today that we were fools because somehow we didn't safeguard this for free, this generosity of our time and this trust in a shared system, in a shared culture. We didn't like engineer a structure that would safeguard that for the public interest. And what happened is that we were expropriated from that, and few monopolies got our work for free and keep getting our work, our time, our engagement for free without us stopping this machinery, getting bigger and more powerful. The third thing is that we believe in one internet for all, one set of rules for all. And today we see that it didn't work that way, that we saw the concentration of power and influence in very few jurisdictions dictating the rules for the rest of us. And that didn't deliver, that really didn't deliver. We see half of the humanity disconnected, most of the humanity connected to an internet of surveillance and control, and excluded from the possibilities of creation and innovation, and very few, very polluted centers of power, Brussels and Washington dictating everything. And then if we go to the next phase, the platformization of digital, we see another lie, similar to the lie of the internet as this tool of freedom and democracy. We saw the platformization of everything was this promise of opportunity and creation and innovation, that it was just the popularization of precarity and austerity on steroids. If you see how it has setbacks, standards on labor protection, for example, on standards of accommodation, if we think of Airbnb, on everything, it globalized precarity and fragility of workers and fragility of consumers everywhere. But I don't want, these 4 points are quite depressing and negative, and I don't think that this is the space for just analyzing this really radiography of what's going on, this picture of what's going on. I believe that we have here the possibility, and this can be a reflection and the parting point of thinking how to shift power. And I believe that without utopia, we cannot progress towards something. We cannot go for positive agendas. And we cannot design the principles and update and upgrade the principles, the internet governance principles that will get us out of here. So the utopia that I have is to recreate. I'm at the moment, and maybe inspired by this and by history. I'm at the moment in former Yugoslavia, and I have been reading a lot of the G77 movement. And I believe that at the moment we hear two discussions. It's US and China. And Europe a little bit involved in the conversations because they have something to offer, something to lose. And then the rest of countries are completely excluded from the conversation, and their agendas are not really positioned. So I believe in unity, and I believe that it's highly likely, it's highly possible that we can reconfigure a non-aligned tech movement, which is one of the ideas that my colleague and friend Juan Ortiz-Froller is promoting. And how this new G77-like setting could push forward a positive agenda for countries of the Global South to update, upgrade, and adapt to our realities, to our potential, and to our needs, those internet governance principles. It shouldn't be an internet governance dictated and implemented just to fit the needs and the wishes of the most powerful tech actors, but it should be they have the power of money and the power of technology, concentrated on the power of data. We still hold the power of multilateralism because we have the numbers. And we still have some institutions that, of course, need an upgrade, update, and repurpose. But I think that that's the way that I see it, and the idea that I want to submit here is we need to create that multilateral space that will fight back and that will fight big tech internationally. A new movement united in solidarity and with a third way, with a different agenda to get back, learn from the lessons of all the innovative agenda that Brazil was promoting to the world early in the 2000s, and bring it to today and implement it in a way that is bottom up, but also top down, and making our politicians and representatives see that there's a big political gain on that, and that the future, because what we cannot separate future from digital at this moment, and we are facing one of the biggest crises, like multiple crises, from climate to democracy to polarization and so on. So we need to get this right. And that's the only way that I see it happening. And that's the idea that I wanted to share with you today, to see if this non-aligned tech movement, this new way, this new tech New Deal is possible, is a reality, and can start in the place where many of these conversations started, which is the country that is still inspiration, North and South Brazil. That's all from me. Sorry if I talk too much, but it was a lot to unpack.
Muito obrigado, Renata. E você disse que nós precisamos manter a utopia, e alguns princípios de governança podem nos tirar dessa situação. Guarda isso, porque nós vamos voltar a esse debate daqui a pouco. Bom, muito obrigado, Renata. Agora passo a palavra para o Wolfgang.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Okay, I have to switch here the okay, I hope it's now. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. You know, I would love to be in Brazil now, though I was with Hartmut together many years, and so I'm happy to see that you are able, even in these difficult times, to organize such a very good platform for discussion. When I was listening to Renata, I was remembering John Lennon, "Give Peace a Chance." When the lyrics goes then at some part, "Maybe I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." And I think this is exactly the point, that the dreams of the fathers of the internet were rather different from what we have today. So the fathers of the internet, as it was pointed out in the early beginnings, this was all this openness, democracy, sharing, and all this philosophy. But the fathers are now grandfathers. And the children of the fathers, and there were some mothers probably also, have the internet first commercialized, then politicized, and now they are on the way to weaponize it. So that means we live in a totally different environment. And when we speak here about the future, it's always risky about the future. In my view, I'm now a grandfather, goes to the grandchildren. So I think this is their challenge. People in their 20s, 30s, that they realize that there has been dreams, then this has moved from one extreme probably to the other extreme. But like always, you know, the truth and the real life is in the middle. And I think this is the challenge for the next 20 years. I think 20 years ago, before the World Summit on the Information Society, I just remember that for another reason, the G8, Russia was still member of this club from the G8, signed the Okinawa Declaration. I think only a small number of people will remember the Okinawa Declaration on the Information Society, which introduced as a governance model to a certain degree the multi-stakeholder approach, and saying, you know, governments alone cannot manage this. We need people from the private sector, from the civil society, from the technical community as fair partners. So that means it's not that you give all the power in one hand, so you have to share this. This was, let's say, the political concept of sharing, which was introduced by Tim Berners-Lee 10 years earlier, when he said, okay, all these new resources and protocols has to be shared, free and openly. So this was 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, the internet was seen more or less as a technical problem with some political implications. So, and it was not really on the agenda of big policy making. So, and today, the internet is indeed a political problem with some technical components. And this has changed dramatically. And furthermore, because now everything is the internet, from security to the economy, to human rights, to our daily life, you know, what Renata has explained, you know, with shopping and working and all this. So insofar, you know, this is now high on the agenda of policymakers, and insofar, this reflects the big controversies of the world. So the dream, which was also articulated by Barlow in his declaration of cyber independence, was we create our own world and the rest of the world remains in their dirty environment of conflicts, wars, and exploitation. So, but unfortunately, this dirty real world is now the internet world, and all the internet issues have been put into the geopolitical conflicts of our globe. And this makes it even more complicated because 20 years ago, the United States was the only big band in town. Today, that's not the case. As you have seen recently in Alaska, when we had the first high-level meeting between the Chinese leadership, it was a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party and the foreign minister, and the Americans were represented by the National Security Advisor and Foreign Minister Blinken. And among other issues, you know, they went straight to cyber issues. And Blinken said, okay, China, you have to stop to attack the United States with cyber attacks. And Chinese, the Politburo member, you know, taking his finger and said, Mr. Blinken, you cannot speak with China in such a tone. You are the master of cyber technology. You attack other countries. So you cannot blame this to others. And so what we had immediately in this 5 minutes in Alaska, you know, the eyes of the world became, saw indeed where we are moving on. So this is a difficult situation, and we are moving in something like what some people have called a new cold cyber war. So is this the future? Is this the perspective for the coming years? Because it's not only attacks, which are critical enough, it's only the whole economy, you know, with all the delivery chains, you know, with the, so we live in an interdependent world. So, and insofar, you know, I personally, if I can make here a very concrete first point, if I would get the question, do we move towards a cyber cold war, which is similar to the 1950s and 60s when the Soviet Union and the Americans clashed over many issues. It was no internet at this time. So my answer is probably no, because there are some similarities. So indeed, we have some similarities to the Cold War. I think the Cold War in the 50s, 60s, that was communism versus capitalism. These were two different systems which could not agree on only very, very small things. But there was a fundamental conflict among systems. And what was also, which are also similar, is mistrust. So the Soviets didn't trust the Americans didn't trust the Soviets. And that's the same now. Chinese do not trust the Americans, and the Americans do not trust the Chinese. So this would be arguments, say, okay, oh, we are moving in a situation similar to the 1950s. But there are some fundamental differences. The first thing is today, we do not have something like the Berlin Wall. So that means there are no big frontiers. So they are working on fragmentation on the internet, walled gardens, and you know, all this. But more or less, the world is rather open. So, and the second thing is the economy is rather interdependent. There was no big links, economic links, between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. So the COCOM rules from the NATO blocked the Eastern Bloc out of any technological development. But today, the UN panel, high-level panel on digital cooperation, has titled its report, "We live in the age of cyber interdependence," not independence as Barlow was dreamed of, but interdependence. That means even if you start now a cold cyber war, I think both sides will have to pay a high price. And this will lead to certain restrictions and constraints. So this doesn't mean that the two cyber superpowers will love each other, but they will fight a battle under certain conditions, respecting something like red lines and avoiding, to be pulled into what people have called a cyber war. Because, parallel to all these fantastic services and applications we have got in the last 20 years or the 30 years since Tim Berners-Lee has invented the internet with all these social networks, search engines, shopping malls, and all this. So the internet is now weaponized. So just the day before yesterday, you have seen the cyber attack from Israel against Iran. So and this continues. So that means the risk is very high that such misuse of the internet for military activities could go out of control and lead to escalation which is not similar to the nuclear war, which was more or less a safeguard, or because the mutual assured destruction worked as a safeguard for both the Soviet Union and the United States not to start a nuclear war. It was too risky. So, and the cyber weapons cannot be compared with the nuclear weapons. But if you attack critical infrastructures and other things, even hospitals has been attacked in the last couple of months. So you risk that so some cascading effects which could lead to such an escalation. Insofar, the future will be very risky and will be overshadowed by this Chinese American cyber conflict. What we see now is that the conflict between, let's say, the two systems, the Chinese Politburo member used in Alaska the terminology, you have your American-style democracy, we have our Chinese-style democracy. You cannot tell us, whether your democracy is better, so we do not interfere in your internal affairs, but we think our Chinese style democracy is very good for the Chinese people, probably not good for other people, but he believed, the Politburo member, that the Chinese style democracy is good for the people. By the way, it was in the Cold War, it was called the people's democracy. I lived in such a people's democracy behind the Iron Curtain, and it was not so good for the people living in a people's democracy, which was different from the Western democracy in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s. So that means, unfortunately, we are, if we discuss the future of the internet, we are in the middle of this geostrategical conflicts. And it's also a question about the future of democracy, about freedoms, about individual rights, and the well-being of people, as Renata has mentioned, referring to labor standards and other things. Because so this is not anymore only about domain names or IP addresses or root servers. So it's now under the big picture. And certainly, looking in the future, academics working with scenarios. So that means you could have a worst-case scenario, then a best-case scenario, and then look, normally the future is in the middle. I think I have still 10 minutes, so I will say some words to how I see the worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is indeed that we are moving towards a situation where we have competing blocks. So the Americans, Joe Biden now has moved immediately to the Indo-Pacific room and to Europe, has revitalized what he called the so-called Swot. This is not an alliance, but a partnership between Japan, Australia, and India. And said to here we have to build a partnership. And then he concentrated on rebuilding the transatlantic partnership with the Europeans. So, and in all the, so more in the Swot discussions, also in the transatlantic partnership discussions. Cybersecurity, the digital economy plays a central role. And in particular, if it comes to the transatlantic partnership, so the situation has changed as it was 5 years ago. So while 5 years ago, Europe was more or less the junior partner of the Americans. But now, you know, with a female tandem on the top of the European Commission, I mean, Ursula von der Leyen and Margrethe Vestager, they have a very clear agenda and that Europe will not be a norm taker. Europe wants to be a norm maker. And they have called just a couple of weeks ago that the 2020 should become the European digital decade. So, and they, you know, what we miss in the system is better regulation. Regulation not as a vehicle for censorship and protectionism or fragmentation, but regulation, the rule of law as a basis for all internet activities. And this starts then with platform regulation and, you know, that you come to issues with digital taxation, trade. So that means the corporations who are the winners also of the pandemic certainly have to pay the bill, which will be presented in the years ahead when we have to struggle with the outcome of the pandemic. So, and all these negotiations in the OECD on digital taxation, or now in the World Trade Organization on digital trade, these are key elements. So that means the transatlantic partnership in cyberspace will be probably a difficult one. It will not be so easy that you build an anti-Chinese bloc like NATO did in the 1950s and 60s against China. So while the Europeans have certainly see China not only as a partner and friend and competitor, they understand quite well that the Chinese democracy is rather similar from the European democracy. So, but they would not make, they would have some problems to become pulled into a total confrontation with China if it comes to cyber. So I think the foreign minister Pompeo under Trump wanted to build what he called the digital fortress. So with the clean digital, the clean internet initiative, clean digital initiative. So, and this was decoupling the economy, which was totally nonsense. So only a very small number of countries followed Mr. Pompeo and is now out of office. So, but I see the language on the American government is not so fundamentally different from if it comes to China, if it as it was with the Trump administration. What about on the other side? So I think between Russia and China, Russia is certainly a big player in this field, and in particular if it comes to cybersecurity. So, and it's not only Kaspersky's and the dancing beer or whatsoever they have in the Troll factory in St. Petersburg. So it is a big country. So and it has a certain say in the cyber field. So and the Russian democracy is much closer to the Chinese democracy. So it was not a big surprise that just 3 days after the meeting in Alaska, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov went to China and had a 2-day meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister, and they discussed also cybersecurity and the digital economy. So I think Alibaba has now bought We-Contacted, the broadest network in Russia. So there is a broad range of relationship between Chinese internet companies and Russian companies. And Russia is a big market, and even more. Already in January, you know, the Russian foreign minister signed a cybersecurity treaty with Iran. And 2 weeks ago, when there was this summit meeting the virtual summit meeting between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the president of Iran, they signed a treaty, 25 years of cooperation. And part of this treaty is they handed over the license to Huawei for building the 5G network in Iran. So that means that now with this attack from yesterday, you know, from Israel against Iran, you see, do we see the building of a new transatlantic, a trans-Asian partnership? it's too early to make any recognition, but from the value system and interest systems approach, you could say, okay, this will be not enough for an alliance, but there are a lot of common interests between Iran, between Russia, and between China, if they are confronted with a cyber challenge from the United States. And this brings not only Europe, but also other countries in a very delicate situation, in particular India. I think India is, with 1.3 billion people next to China, has the highest number of potential internet users. At the moment, they have 600, 700 million internet users. So it's a big market. And the Indian president was in the last couple of months very strict that cyber and digital issues are high on its agenda. He kicked out TikTok and WeChat from China and introduced very strong rules against Facebook and Twitter. And in New Delhi, they have started now a debate remembering the 1950s when the Warsaw Pact was established. And the then Indian Prime Minister Nehru said, okay, we do not want to get pulled into a conflict between NATO and Warsaw Pact. So and Nehru became the initiator, what became the non-aligned movement. And the interesting thing is that in China now, in India, some people remember this and say, isn't time ripe for a digital non-aligned movement? So we are not interested to be pulled into this Chinese-American cyber conflict and with their partners. So let's do outreach. And immediately you see a number of potential partners. The non-aligned movement had around 130, 140 member states. So, and created a group of 77 in the United Nations, which was growing over the years. So I think a lot of African countries, a lot of Asian countries, a lot also of Latin American countries would think twice and say, if we have to pick a partner, China or the United States, is there a third option? And can we do something else? So the African Union has just recently established a 10-year plan for the digital transformation of Africa. So, and Africa becomes now a battlefield because on the one side, the Chinese offer all infrastructure, Lenovo, Huawei, all this is now very present in Africa. On the other side, the Americans, offer a lot of money. And from Europe, the first trip from Ursula von der Leyen, the new commissioner from the EU, was Addis Ababa, where they signed a digital partnership between the EU and the African Union. And they have opened in December the first digital hub for this European-African digital partnership. And this remembers also on the Cold War time when the president of Egypt, Mr. Nasser, said, okay, we take money from the Russians, we take money from the Americans, but we want to remain independent. So I think this is more or less the big picture and would be the worst case scenario. The best case scenario, and I will finish with in a couple of minutes with the best case scenario, would be that all realize this is slippery territory. If we move too fast or too far, this has risky side effects which could go out of control. Let's find a middle way between cooperation and confrontation. And suddenly the United Nations comes back as an interesting platform for the promotion of cooperation. And this was insofar a good moment that the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, after he convened the high-level panel a couple of years ago, offered the United Nations as a platform for multi-stakeholder cooperation related to the internet. Years ago, I think, there were plans that the United Nations will overtake the internet or will control the internet. Some people remember the days of the World Summit Information Society when the ITU as a UN organization, was trying to get the hand over the domain name system. So, but now things have changed and the United Nations has no plans to overtake the internet or to control the domain name system, but they offer itself as a platform for multi-stakeholder cooperation. This is new and this is an interesting opportunity. And it was a big surprise, even for me, to see that regardless of this geopolitical conflict in cyberspace between China and the United States, I think both sides could agree 3 weeks ago on the final report of the open-ended working group, which is a group which was established 2 years ago to deal with cybersecurity issues. So that means we have a certain contradiction here. On the one hand, we see the growing of conflicts. On the other hand, we see that within the United Nations, you know, China, Russia, the EU, and the US could agree. The report has no big substance, but it's a very symbolic consensus. The first time since 6 years on this high level of cyber superpowers, we have reached a consensus. And this is also a sign of hope that you can say, okay, you could build on this. The mandate for the open-ended working group is now enlarged until 2025. That means we do have now in the United Nations a channel to discuss cybersecurity on equal footing among all member states. So, and you have some interesting signs that the negotiations in the OECD and the World Trade Organization on agreement on digital taxation and digital trade could be reached. I think the weak point here, what I see is that we have no progress in the field of human rights. And if you look into the agenda of the Human Rights Council, the United Nations Human Rights Council, which ended last week, so they discussed everything, but no digital rights. So the rapporteur on the right to privacy, Katanaki, made a very good report about artificial intelligence and privacy, but they took note and did not discuss it and did not adopt a resolution. So I think while we see probably some signs of cooperation in the field of economy and in the field of security, human rights could become the victim of this. And insofar, I can only support what Renata has said, you know, when she said we have the numbers. So that means we need a new multi-stakeholder coalition to, let's say, to reiterate the dreams of the founding fathers of the internet and to say, no, that's not a space for political conflicts. That is not a place for economic exploitation. That is not a place for violation of human rights, for mass surveillance and censorship. This is a place for freedom and democracy. So certainly we have to cooperate with others. So there is no alternative to sit together in multi-stakeholder fora, you know, with representatives from the private sector, with governments. But I think the biggest achievement, what was reached in this process since the World Summit, is still the Net Mundial Declaration, which was adopted in Sao Paulo in the year 2014. So it's nearly forgotten, but it would be a shame if the declaration would be put into the archives of the history books and would be totally forgotten. I think it's up to community to read the document again. And if you read it again, I did it this morning, then you see, okay, it sounds as it was written today or yesterday. So it's a very topical document and you should get a lot of inspiration from this. And as Renata, I'm sorry that I spoke too long, but it's a big issue. And thank you very much and back to you.
Ok, Wolfgang, muito obrigado pelas suas palavras introdutórias. Você mencionou que, como big picture, que nós estamos no meio de um conflito geoestratégico, né? E que a cooperação internacional e a regulamentação serão elementos chaves, inclusive, para tentar mitigar os riscos de um cenário pior, né, de conflitos militares alimentados pela internet. Eu queria, então, passar para o bloco 2, para nós explorarmos um pouco mais profundamente isso e trazer junto também a abordagem da Renata na fala introdutória dela sobre a necessidade de utopia. Lembro que grandes empresas de tecnologia, elas criaram ambientes controlados para manter os seus usuários dentro de suas plataformas. né? E elas oferecem a esses usuários uma gama de serviços, um leque de serviços e produtos dentro desses ambientes. E hoje, por exemplo, já nem faz tanto sentido criar uma página web para realizar um serviço transacional, como comprar, vender, pagar, reclamar, né, interagir, porque você pode fazer tudo isso dentro de uma plataforma de rede social, né, dentro de um app, né? E, além disso, essas plataformas também têm servido de canais de desinformação, de polarização de ideias, né? E creio que o pior de tudo isso é que elas têm se apropriado das informações, né, sobre o comportamento privado, né, têm se apropriado dos dados pessoais. Voltando, né, ao tema web, né, e ao seu criador, Tim Berners-Lee, ele no passado, né, ainda que talvez ingenuamente ou não tão ingênuo, mas carregado da utopia, ele acreditou que a web seria uma plataforma neutra, que a humanidade como usuária, e a humanidade sendo boa e má intrinsecamente, né, ela apenas iria fazer o link, né, a marcação, né, da sua lista de favoritos, iriam abandonar as coisas que não seriam boas, que não serviriam, e aproveitar todas as coisas que eram boas para si, né? Porém, ele percebeu que, mais recentemente, ele mudou de posição, porque ele percebeu que tudo isso levou à criação de bolhas, né? E ele mesmo falou que depois do Brexit e depois do Trump, né, percebeu-se que era necessário ter uma web que, na verdade, espalhasse muito mais verdades do que lixo, como está acontecendo atualmente. E aí, né, recentemente, via Web Foundation, de novo, ele declarou que não se trata apenas de levar a web para todos, mas a web tem que servir à humanidade de uma forma positiva. Então, pensando nisso e naquilo que vocês falaram, né, eu queria trazer duas perguntas, né, a primeira delas para a Renata, né, de que forma a internet, como está posta hoje, ela agride a ideia de servir à humanidade de uma forma positiva, né? Como que essas formas elas estão se contrapondo à ideia da internet como um bem comum, né? Como que ela está impactando esse nosso ideal utópico de um espaço, de um ciberespaço colaborativo e que serve à humanidade de uma forma positiva. E para o Wolfgang, né, eu trago a pergunta exatamente dentro do contexto que ele falou, né, na big picture que ele deu. A governança da internet está posta hoje para servir à humanidade de uma forma positiva, ou você entende que a governança da internet, o papel dela hoje é mitigar os danos que já são inevitáveis por conta desse conflito geoestratégico que você tão bem colocou? Renata?
First quick comments. I think that hello, can you hear me well? Yes. So I think that we talk a lot about the father of the internet, and now is the moment of the granddaughters of the internet to take over. So, that's the interesting, and I'm in between, I'm in between these generations. And I think that the hope And the energy and the excitement that I am seeing is not necessarily only in the global south, but north and south. Lots of young people, especially young feminists, are racing, I like seizing power, the power of creation, the power of expression, the power of coding, and the power of designing different digital infrastructures. That excitement of, let's say, a parallel digital world already happening is not isolated from what's happening on the physical world. And that makes me really excited, because I see that it is the invisible somehow. It is the invisible, the subversive, the underground developments that they're still not visible in the regulation sphere. They're still not visible in the digital mainstream of our little bubbles of experts and political experts on these and superpowers. But it is happening in the periphery and in the underground. And it is something you can already sense it, as you were saying, Wolfgang, in politics in Europe. And you can already sense it in the dissidents inside big tech companies. And I think that fills my heart with hope. Because I think that many things, it is many years have passed since women have been excluded from this power of creation and power of subversion and imagining new structures. And slowly this generation is gaining power and influence in shaping these digital futures. But of course, I think that one of the dangers I see and one of the limitations I see is that power is still a male-dominated world and power is still a money-dominated world, which is almost the same, It's the two sides of the same coin. And while regulation is praised and while the European model is praised, it's still colonial. And when we talk, for example, transatlantic dialogues or assistance programs to Africa on this decade of digital development, we see the same colonizers now come as aid agencies and technical cooperation agencies telling top-down Africans how to, and as they did with Latin Americans, how to govern digital futures. We need to break this colonial dynamic. And one of the things, when I think of this possible future that will improve rights, we need to place the Internet of people back at the center. We need to place people at the center rather than systems. And we need to recognize that we live in a diverse world with a diverse group of people where one size does not fit all. And I think that the problem that we have now is this idea of global standards where the local is sacrificed. And I remember, when developing nations were pushed to implement IP, intellectual property regulation. It was a disaster for access to knowledge. It was a disaster for innovation. And we have seen, I think that the most tangible example that we have now is with the vaccines. I think that we need more imagination in the digital sphere, and we need for a possible digital future, we need to imagine a different way to implement and to adapt regulations and to adapt permissions to innovate, permissions to exceptions and limitations, not only on copyright, but on patents and innovation and even privacy rules enforcement, because imposing EU high gold standards on certain rules in countries where you have not solved more existential problems is going to just crystallize the inequalities that we have today. And the other reflection is on the UN. I think that together with fixing our digital world, we need to fix multilateralism. It is I love and trust the UN system, but it needs a major makeover to serve these new generations and to survive a world where some tech empires are more powerful than entire countries or even continents. I think that we need to seize the opportunity of all the conversations around the Green New Deal to push for this Tech New Deal, and to push it, to take back, as Wolfgang said, the lessons from Net Mundial, bring them back to life, bring back all the lessons and all the pending agenda, the Doha agenda, the World Trade Organization. Look at all the progress that we look back 25 years. Look at all the progress that we did globally, and packed it all together in this new pact that will take us to the next stage, and a stage where we cannot separate the digital fights for better rights from the fight against austerity, from the fight against corruption and concentration of power, from the fights for democracy and for the fights for a future with gender and race equality. And of course, for the fight against climate change, for a fair climate justice, basically. So I think that when I imagine this New Deal is the combination of all these factors: feminist future, anti-austerity future, green future, and a future with gender and race equity, and a future with the possibility for everyone to innovate. I think that's to me, that's the biggest hope, to give back to the new generations, to unlock again the power of innovation, which is completely locked in monopolies today. So those are my final reflections. I really hope that it is not a process that will only be discussed in Geneva. It's a process that starts the communities, in the favelas, with the people creating things, in the universities, everywhere, with the new generations starting to imagine different digital infrastructures. And we need to see it as an ecosystem, and an ecosystem digital that is interlinked with other systems that are broken and need fixing or reinvention. That's my general overview of it.
Obrigado. Muito obrigado, Renata. Guarda essa sua fala sobre novo ecossistema e essa agenda para novas gerações, feminismo, racismo, crise climática, que nós vamos voltar a isso no bloco seguinte, quando nós tentarmos pensar um pouco sobre como saímos disso, qual é a proposta para o futuro. Passo agora, então, para o Wolfgang. Por favor, Wolfgang.
Thank you. Renata, the Tech New Deal is really good concept. And the first test could be at WSIS plus 20. So 20 years after WSIS, there will be a big review conference in 2025. This is not so far away. And if I remember that the whole WSIS process took also around 4 or 5 years, and if you go through the WSIS documents, a lot of the dreams you have outlined in your first intervention, has been included into the text. So from today's perspective, the documents from Geneva and from Tunis sometimes sound like a fairy tale. So if you compare it with the reality of today. So it means to revive from the Human Rights Declaration and the Charter of the United Nations to recent documents like the Net Mundial Declaration. I think this is insofar a good guideline. When you refer to the United Nations, I see we should be aware that if governments always refer to the principles of international law, that's not only the sovereignty of states. They use the terminology cyber sovereignty. But the key principle is the self-determination of people. So that means the sovereignty of state is the, let's say, the outcome of the self-determination of people. And I think this is the starting point. So it's the people who create all these things, and from the favelas to the university, as I say. So, and insofar, if we try to use the United Nations as a platform for further discussion, revitalizing the multilateral system on equal footing, but bringing also in stakeholders from civil society, technical community, and others. So then I think the right to self-determination of people is probably the best guideline. And a third point I want to mention is, unfortunately, I'm rather realistic that you will not avoid that the internet becomes more and more pulled in all these political conflicts, military conflicts, and with more economic opportunities. You will see also more economic battles and with mass surveillance and facial recognition and all this. So that means the future is not as bright as we had hoped for. But it's for all your counter movements, you need a functioning internet. And this is a big surprise that even, taking into account all these political conflicts, the basic infrastructure of the internet has worked and continues to work. It has accommodated an incredible growth from 1 million users to 100 million users to 1 billion to now nearly 4 or 5 billion users. And even the pandemic has demonstrated that the infrastructure we have, the domain name system, the IP address system, the root servers, which is in the hands of the technical community, private sector, and with a high involvement of civil society organization, has not only survived, but has demonstrated that a governance model which governs such an important resource, an important technical resource, can be managed in a way which is not be pulled into military, economic, or other conflicts. Insofar, I think it was a wise decision by ICANN's CEO and President Göran Marby to introduce the language of technical internet governance. So because certainly Göran is afraid that ICANN could be pulled into all these conflicts. And you see already, that some governments say the registrars or the ISPs, they could be the police of the internet and all this. So this would be a disaster for the functioning of the internet as a whole. Insofar, the terminology used by Göran, the technical internet governance, is not so brand new. Already if you go back to the definition of internet governance proposed by the working group on internet governance 15 years ago, we differentiated between the development and the use of the internet. So the use of the internet, these are all this political, economic, and other conflicts. The development of the internet is a more technical process. And insofar, to enhance this technical cooperation and to demonstrate that the global resource, interest of the global community, regardless of the intention of the user, works. I think this has a big demonstrating effect, and to say, okay, as Ralph said, there is hope. So we can demonstrate in certain areas the community is able, in ICANN language is called now the empowered community, is able, to solve problems and to manage resources in the interest of all. That's not enough. This can be only the starting point, but it's always good to have such good examples. Back to you.
Ok. Wolfgang, eu volto vou falar com você e vou insistir um pouco na pergunta sobre se o nosso destino atual com relação à governança da internet é promover uma internet que sirva à humanidade, ou se é, considerando que a sua perspectiva para o futuro da internet não é tão otimista, se nos está reservado o destino de mitigar os problemas que nós temos hoje na internet. Wolfgang.
Hartmut Glaser will remember when Bill Clinton addressed the ICANN meeting in San Francisco more than 10 years ago. Under Clinton, ICANN was established. So he spoke about what his understanding of internet governance, and he said it's very difficult, what it is. And so we my impression, this was Clinton's words, is that internet governance is like stumbling forward, so into unknown territory. That means a lot of these things we are dealing with, even if we have now the World Wide Web 30 years and the internet nearly 50 years, so it's still, I would not say new territory, but we are in the early days, and we did not oversee the consequences, when the first social network started, what this will be. We did not see the consequences of search engines when they started. At this time, it was still CompuServe, we had also Yahoo and some others, and Google was just a nice, small company, don't do evil. So that means a lot of these developments, which we see now, are misused or lead to have unintended consequences, and, pull groups with different intentions, money makers, criminals, into the space. So insofar, it's really time to restart and to see, okay, this was not the intention. This is what has been produced as a result of a free flow and all these wonderful slogans like innovation without permission and all this, but without guidelines, without certain barriers. So this has moved into directions which are now very quite counterproductive, and it's always stumbling forward. So that means it makes no big things now, make no big sense to think about what would be in the year 2050. So we need really a deep conceptual discussion how to correct the bad developments which has taken place the last 10 years. We have to identify the threats and to develop a new strategy. And so that means the cards has to be reshuffled. And now we see much clearer. I think all cards are on the table. But it would be too simple to expect that, with 2 or 3 international treaties or a couple of national regulations, we could channel the whole development in the right direction. And internet development is now the development of the society and the economy. So you cannot exclude it anymore. And insofar, the battle for a good internet is a battle for a good democracy. And this is not an easy battle, and it will be different. I think the recommendation to see the diversity of the world, that there is no one size fits all, and even in new partnerships between US and EU or China and Russia on the other side, there is a lot of diversity. The Russian foreign minister always uses the terminology, we live in a multipolar world, and Brazil certainly, is one of the poles, even if it's under the president now less active in this field. So Madame Rousseff was much more active, and but Brazil, after the next election, could be back because it's a big player, and insofar to make precise expectations, whether we will move in the one or the other direction, it's an ongoing battle, and it's stumbling forward. Back to you.
Obrigado, Wolfgang. Ainda gostaria de avançar agora para um outro bloco que eu creio que é um bloco que pode nos trazer um pouco mais de esperança, né? Lidar um pouco com essa ideia de um novo ecossistema, de pensarmos, né, como o Wolfgang falou agora, olha, tudo que fizemos, a intenção que tínhamos não era essa, era uma outra coisa. Então, a pergunta é, será que nós podemos ter a web que nós queremos? E aí eu lembro, né, novamente, assim, o Tim Berners-Lee, recentemente, ele fez algumas sugestões, né, deu alguns exemplos do que nós poderíamos ter, né, para melhorar o ambiente da web. Ele citou o exemplo do Birdwatch, do Twitter, em que os usuários podem, de uma maneira colaborativa, sinalizar as informações que estão incorretas circulando pelas redes sociais. Ele também tem uma própria iniciativa, que é o Solid, né, da qual, né, as aplicações, né, da plataforma Solid, elas devolvem aos usuários o controle, né, dos seus próprios dados, ou seja, os usuários definem quais dados eles disponibilizam e para quem esses dados são disponibilizados. Enfim, vem surgindo, né, um conjunto de ideias como que para reinventar, né, a maneira de utilizar a internet, né? Como o Wolfgang falou, uma coisa é o desenvolvimento técnico da internet e a outra coisa é o uso que é feito dela, né? Então, né, pensando nos cenários futuros, será que é possível fazer esse descolamento, né, o desenvolvimento descolado do uso da internet, né? Será que é possível nós termos a internet, a web que nós queremos? Qual é o cenário futuro e sugestões que vocês colocam? Renata.
I'm super excited to answer this question because it's precisely on what I am working right now. And one of the things I have to say something, I kind of gave up on the private sector because the private sector, you know, the big tech private sector is shielded. We enable a very sophisticated infrastructure of trade agreements and deregulation that kind of make it almost impossible to modify their behavior. And they keep pushing for more privilege, more tax exemptions, and trade secret laws impeding us to even audit anything that happens inside. I think that effectively another tech future is possible. And for that, we need public institutions, and we need to democratize the tech cycle of the technology that the public sector applies. How so? I mean, COVID crisis showed us the urgency to digitize everything, basically. And lots of public funds will be invested in this digitization process. And the lazy way of doing it will be just open procurement and for the same big tech companies that got only richer with the crisis, just let them, assert the state. So the state becomes more dependent and more weak and more unable to do their own things. And we are kind of managed by systems centralized by tech empires. What I'm proposing with the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms and Other Spaces, so my agenda of decolonization is different. What I'm proposing is to the same way that we democratize the way that laws are made and the way we are governed, we should democratize the technology cycle. And you don't need engineering degree for that. Of course we need engineers, of course we need designers, but we need that ability to design technology in the public interest back inside the public institutions. And we need to involve citizens in that. Instead of, reporting data sets of making more efficient the private companies centralized in Silicon Valley or in China. What I am proposing here is far more ambitious. What I am proposing here is, for example, if we are going to design, if the Ministry of Education is going to design the distance education platform, what about involving teachers? What about involving parents, involving the students in different socioeconomic circumstances using it? And it is not a process of designing the technology of the future and the interconnectedness of the future only when it is from the start, from the moment it is conceived, to the moment it is invested, to the moment it is tested, and keep the cycle going and do far more, tech audits. The other thing is going back to this North-South and South-South cooperation in the same, public interest framing on public interest technology and as infrastructure. I think that the privatization of our infrastructure that we cannot even have with the degree of digitization today, that we cannot even have key data about the pandemic is terrible. And we need to get the power of data in the public interest back into the public sphere. It doesn't need to be state. It can be municipalities, the ones playing a big role. And all of this, of course, is part of my big idea of the Tech New Deal and the idea of the non-aligned tech movement. And it is our taxes at the end of the day. So we can make a decision of paying those taxes to Microsoft or to Huawei, or developing our own capacities inside our industry and sharing those abilities and in principles of open innovation, free software, openly available content and hardware to other nations. I think that this tech diplomacy can be very, very, very effective. And the last thing is adaptable, unhackable, adaptable to our realities and cultural needs. And the last one is, do not burden citizens with more duties. Let's make Facebook better. Let's report the fake news by WhatsApp. All these burdens in citizens. I mean, we already are under huge pressure. I think that what we need to push forwards is a digital social innovation system enabling citizens. We need to invest, people have a lot of potential. And again, they don't need to be like the techies in a hoodie, they can be artists, they can be dancers, they can be cooks, but digital is, part of our lives now. And I think that if any, I think that we should really invest in digital social innovation and participation and collaboration, as we did some decades ago, reinvent the public space, reinvent the library, reimagine public institutions and the relation of digital with creation for social benefit and not only for profit. And I think that this all converges, this all converges and can be directed on all the funds that will be allocated to fight against climate change. I think that connects the new knowledge, the old knowledge, the ability of the global South to adapt and to innovate, the ability of the institutions to get back their mandate and act in the public interest. If we move away from the logic of profit and the private sector, not to abandon it, but that's a space very hard to get into, and we get back into the public role of all of this, I think that a possibility is open. And I firmly believe that it can be sectorial. So if we start, for example, with climate and education, for example, or climate education and access to culture, and it can be from local to global, or a federation of local, concretely the municipalities. So those are my general ideas on how to solve this for this Tech New Deal, and makes me very excited. I think that if we look at the numbers and if we look at the obscene amount of money that goes to the same 5 companies from all the governments all over the world, especially in the global south, and the dependencies that we have in this in this very fragile geopolitical confrontation. We cannot afford. Not only we cannot afford without infrastructure, because 2 countries are having a fight and we have to pick a side. But we can also, like, it is silly just to pay, let our data go, let our tax money go, and do not develop local abilities. I think that, and local abilities transcend just the coding and the design. And I think that all members of the community have a say. And when all the members of a community that the technology is serving are involved in the design, development, deployment, and audit of the technologies we use to solve social problems, the technology definitely serves people better without one-size-fits-all regulation and without expensive reparations later when the damage is done.
Obrigado, Renata. E você vai voltar, viu, Renata? Você vai ter que falar, porque tem uma pergunta aqui para você, para dar exemplos práticos sobre essas coisas que te deixam muito animada com o futuro da internet. Você vai voltar. Wolfgang, o que você me diz sobre os cenários futuros e o que nós podemos fazer, inclusive algumas dessas ideias do Tim Berners-Lee sobre participação, para melhorar a web que temos.
I like Renata's reference to enabling policy, the concept of enabling policies. I think this was the concept Tony Giddens introduced in the 1990s when he was proposing a so-called third way. So like a lot of the dreams of academics, so it didn't work as expected, but the concept to enable the citizens to take their destiny in their own hands is very close to what I mentioned earlier, the right of self-determination. And this means, so you have to have, let's say, qualified users, experienced users who understand how the system works and can make use of it and can it further develop it. So that means this is the only way forward because the infrastructure certainly determines to a certain way also the way how we use the technology. And if we have, let's say, hierarchical infrastructure, then we are pulled into a hierarchy. If we have a decentralized infrastructure, where all the knowledge and the power is on the edges, then we have a more decentralized system, which is much more democratic and is a standing invitation to participate in the processes. Insofar, the multi-stakeholder model, as it was introduced in the World Summit on the Information Society, is still the best model. Unfortunately, a lot of governments which support the multi-stakeholder model pay just lip service. They argue, yeah, that's great, and we are talk to business and to civil society, but what they called earlier consultations, they have labeled it now multi-stakeholder cooperation. But consultations, if you consult with somebody, this is not the multi-stakeholder idea of sharing, of working together, hand in hand on equal footing in their respective roles. Certainly, civil society organizations play a different role than governments or transnational corporations, but it has to be on equal footing. So the worst case scenario, and unfortunately this is very often the case in many countries, is that under the multi-stakeholder model, big business and big government goes together. This is the worst case and leads to tyranny. So, and unfortunately, this is the case with the civil society and other citizens group are removed, and all things are managed in this, what a lot of people call public-private partnership. This is, if in Germany, for instance, if the German government says, yeah, we have to remove some bad content, but we as a democratic government, we do not want to remove this, we send it to Facebook, and Facebook should do the work, and then Facebook says, yes, we want to have peace with the German government, we will remove everything, which is critical. So that means the loser in such a mechanism is the right to freedom of expression, and at least the right to privacy. So that means fundamental human rights. And insofar, we have also to acknowledge that the multi-stakeholder model, which was introduced first in ICANN and then the World Summit Information Society, and further elaborated in the Net Mundial Conference, has shown us now in the last couple of years that it has conceptual weaknesses, because we do not have institutions, procedures, rules, how to implement this. So that means we have a very nice multi-stakeholder discussion, as in the United Nations Internet Governance Forum. Brazil hosted twice the IGF. So, but this is discussion. If it comes to decision, so there are no stakeholders on the table. Either it's only governmental or it's, business. Even the, I would say it was like not such a bad idea from Facebook to say, okay, we want to have an independent oversight body. Here you have money, and then, some recognized persons will then control us whether we make the right decision in content curation or content moderation. So this is inside the system. So that means it has to be seen. The work of the Facebook Oversight Board has just started. What will happen with the first conflict? So the first 6 decisions were 5 against Facebook. So Mark Zuckerberg said, yes, okay, so we will remove this. We want to be a good corporation. But this is really playing, like in the sandbox. So this is not the real issue. And insofar, I think indeed we need a more advanced, conceptual advanced and institutional advanced multi-stakeholder system. Unfortunately, when I can discuss the JANA transition and the idea of the empowered community popped up and say, okay, we have to get the ICANN board under control. In certain cases, the community has to have the right to fire the board and to control the budget. So the mechanism which was then introduced under the headline of the empowered community is so complex that nobody understands it really how it works. And now 6 years after its introduction, so there has been some cases where you could have mobilized the empowered community, like the .org case or some others, but nobody knows really, how you could mobilize the empowered community. So this is a lesson learned. You can learn from your mistakes. I would not say the JANA transition was a mistake, but the conceptualization of what's called now the empowered community was not such a brilliant result. So let's think forward. So one idea we discussed recently with the OSCE in Vienna, which is has an office on freedom of expression, and they had a workshop on freedom of expression and AI, was, we have to have an independent dispute resolution mechanism. But it means if there are disputes, you cannot leave it in the hand of the government or in the hand of the corporation. So we have to invent something new. So in ICANN, when we, in the early days, we invented the so-called UDRP when a lot of conflicts emerged about domain names. So, and you have the UDRP system is a rather independent system. Let's take this as a source of inspiration and to build an independent judiciary. I wouldn't say with cyber courts and cyber judges, but a mechanism which would be decentralized and allow really the third party, the people themselves, to take decision if there are conflicts between government on the one side and corporations on the other side, or between the citizens and the government and the citizens and and the corporations. So this is part of the dreaming agenda. So, and you could go through all the elements, of the democratic society. That's a thing. We have to have new institutions which guarantee a fair balance between the various stakeholders, that no stakeholder can dominate the future development, and then all legitimate interests and fundamental rights and freedoms are adequately respected. So it's a long way to go, but history never ends. Back to you.
Obrigado, Wolfgang. Eu não sei se eu consigo captar plenamente o que a concepção dos dois, mas eu sinto que parece que há uma pequena tensão entre a proposição que a Renata faz e a proposição que o Wolfgang faz. Eu percebo que parece que a Renata aposta mais na criação de um novo ecossistema na internet que gere políticas habilitadoras de cidadãos comuns e que vai viabilizar inovações sociais, né, e não sobrecarregar os cidadãos. E, por outro lado, me parece que o Wolfgang aposta mais, né, no desenvolvimento de uma infraestrutura descentralizada, uma infraestrutura técnica descentralizada e uma cooperação global dentro do sistema, né? Acho que há uma tensão e eu queria que os dois comentassem sobre isso, se eu estou fazendo uma leitura correta do posicionamento dos dois. Renata?
Yes, you are, and it is this inevitable tension. I don't think that the system right now is serving people, like the multi-stakeholder system. I mean, it has been as Wolfgang pointed out, it has been running 20 years, and it only got the situation only got with the current governance system. The situation only got worse for people. And especially for the new generations, I still enjoyed a little bit of the Internet of creation and the Internet of possibilities. The kids today are connecting at the Internet of hyper monetization of everything they do without anything given back to them, without the possibilities given back to them, except becoming a star on TikTok. I mean, so what I'm proposing is not a replacement of system, but a creation of a parallel system. This digital social innovation system that it is, to play by different rules and allocate different resources. Instead of competing, it's just opening a crack in the system, a space to let some air in. We know that venture capitalists are not investing, for example, in women innovators. That's a fact. We know that monopolists, the tech monopolists, are often inclined to, just produce general technology that is applied the same everywhere, and usually is poor internet and poor technology for the global poor. And the system is not delivering for the social purpose. Basically, the commercial potential of digital technologies is fully out. And it is this fight, with blood and geopolitics involved, and even nuclear stuff going on between the giants. But for the group of countries that I described, that are the countries that are neither producing big players in the consumption of these technologies, we are left with very little. So what I'm proposing, more than attention, is maybe it was not clear that what I'm proposing is some complementarity, creating, opening opening spaces of innovation and creation inside the local. Very concrete example. I mean, I remember all the possibilities that were unlocked in Brazil in parallel to Net Mundial. That's a beautiful example. In parallel to Net Mundial, there was the Arena Net Mundial. And I remember that while the internet was being discussed at the Net Mundial, which was, for those who are not familiar with, who are like too young to remember, it was these multi-stakeholder discussions and heads of state and ministers, very formal language. You have 5 minutes to finish your statement, declarations, diplomatic language, and so on. In parallel, you will go to this magical space that was created by the municipality of Sao Paulo on the side of the event. And it was beautiful. It was amazing because it was a space of, you will see all the young people creating and proposing and experimenting with new technologies and also experimenting with new rules. And it was unlocking the potential of communities of creators, of communities of innovators outside the entrepreneur, like hyper-capitalistic dynamic is what we need. I mean, we need the best minds. We need the best minds of the new generations going back to the public sphere. And that's what I'm proposing here. And going and combining digital skills with social awareness and public interest as guiding principles instead of data mining and profit. So that's my vision. I know that it is idealistic, but it is already happening. There's already like lots of people with that state of mind, lots of people who love digital, see the potential of digital, but refuse to work for Silicon Valley. And it is the state, the only one, is our taxes, is the public money, the only money that can unlock that potential, because the other system works following profit as the guiding principle.
Obrigado, Wolfgang.
Yeah, thank you. Listening to Renata, I remember the discussions we had when I was probably as young as Renata about evolution and revolution. So this is an endless debate, but which is very fruitful and useful. And you need this conflict between idealism on the one hand and pragmatism on the other hand. So because without revolutionary ideas, without idealism, nothing will happen. And insofar, but you should not expect to translate all these ideas one-to-one in a reasonable time frame. So insofar, to find the right balance between an idealistic approach and a pragmatic approach, to take the reality as it is and to try to channel certain developments to correct certain mistakes and, a lot of small steps. So that means small steps are always, that's my experience of life, are better than big jumps. And by the way, if you look back into bigger time frames, 20, 30 years, then sometimes you are surprised that an silent evolution, or let's say an evolution, has led to a silent revolution, so that things after 30 years are looking rather different than it was 30 years ago. And insofar, the way forward needs this open dialogue, this idealistic input, and the let's say the realistic to take note of the reality, so that you do not lose the contact to the world as it is, but do not take the world as it is uncritical. So that means the first thing you have to do is a critical evaluation of the reality. In the academic world, we have called this Swot analysis. So that means you have to look at a phenomenon, you have to look in the strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats which come with the phenomenon. And I think we need more of this SWOT analysis so that we are not too impressed by big commercial success or by other things and say, okay, wait a minute, what is the side effect? You know, one of my favorite quotations from Karl Marx, so I'm trained in Marxism-Leninism, as you probably know, so was that when he reflected about the industrial age, he was excited about all these new industrial things which happened, you know, with trains and machinery and all this. But then he said, you know, the crazy thing is that everything is pregnant with its contrary. So that means the unique opportunities of the industrial age produced exploitation, you know, very bad working conditions, you know, at the end of the day, war among nations. So, and I think this lessons learned from the Industrial Revolution and how, you know, the world reacted to the opportunities and the threats by having no neutral analysis. So that means the proposal Mr. Marx made to how to solve this conflict, you know, didn't work as well. So that was a complicated journey, you know. But the issue is not so different today if we look in the digital problems and a lot of things which happened with the beginning of the second and third industrial revolution, you know, can be sometimes looking like a blueprint for things, what is happening here. You know, Renata mentioned labor standards. So that means one reaction in the industrial age was the building of trade unions. So does digital workers have trade unions? Is there other digital trade unions to fight for their rights? So that means it took a long way that the trade unions really became a strong partner and were accepted by the business. So, but isn't this another missing link in the system? Another weakness in the system we have today? There are no digital trade unions. That means all these individual workers are more or less step by step losing fundamental rights. And, you know, with more home office and more homeschooling, this gets even worse, I expect. So that means to learn something from history is always good. You cannot take history one-to-one, so this is misleading, but you can get some inspiration from it. Back to you.
Obrigado, Wolfgang. É uma discussão que certamente está aberta, porque entendo que, né, por tudo que nós discutimos até agora, né, temos um ponto que me parece comum, que é uma discussão sobre ética. Né? Creio que todos os pontos que nós colocamos, eles convergem para essa necessária reflexão sobre uma ética que nós precisamos ter acordada para o futuro da web. E com isso, nós estamos encerrando o bloco 3 e queria passar para o bloco final agora, que são algumas perguntas. Nós ainda temos 10 minutos para nós no nosso seminário. E tenho aqui algumas perguntas, são poucas, mas eu vou fazer essa pergunta, vou fazer e vou distribuir, né, são 3 perguntas, eu acho, 4. Vou fazer a pergunta, passar a primeira pergunta para o Wolfgang, feito pelo Credson Isaac. Ele diz assim: hoje a nossa internet é uma fábrica de fake news, infelizmente. E nós perdemos mais tempo verificando a veracidade ou não da informação do que absorvendo a informação. E aí ele pergunta: a liberdade, ela pode ser tão livre assim? que possa permitir esse exército de fake news, creio que o uso da liberdade se torna uma ferramenta, neste caso, ferramenta de domínio, que é uma antítese do conceito de liberdade. Gostaria que o Wolfgang comentasse essa pergunta e posicionamento do Credson.
Yes. Freedom of information could be the subject of the next seminar. This is a big issue. It goes back to the invention of the printing press, and then the Catholic Church was first excited about the opportunity to print the Bible, and then it was used by people to criticize the Catholic Church, and then they introduced a system of censorship and saying this is not allowed. So that means the issue of what is the right content, what is allowed, what is not allowed, has a history of 500 years, and we will be unable to settle this issue for the future. But I will go to another interesting philosopher. 200 years ago, Jean-Baptiste Lagoda, a French philosopher, and this is another favorite quotation, said, between the rich and the poor, it is freedom which suppresses and law which liberates. I think this is a very interesting and very clear, very brief statement. So that means freedom among equals. It's different as freedom among unequals. So, and in so far, you have to put freedom in a certain context. In the French Revolution, when they discussed freedom, they said, okay, the freedom of your fist stops at the peak of my nose. So that means freedom means to recognize the freedom of others, which is also an important philosophical thing. If it comes to fake news and hate speech and all this, what we are discussing, I was against any type of regulation 20 years ago, but with the growing misuse of the internet, I think we need reasonable, innovative regulation. So smart regulation, some people have just called smart regulation, which will not introduce censorship, but which will help us to get rid of all this, let's say, bad things. And the very final point, the person who asked the question said, we are so busy now with checking all our mails from early morning till late in the evening. And this leads me to another duty of the state to offer an education system which enable the end users to deal with this. There is no need to read every senseless nonsense you have on your internet. If you know how the system works, you can ignore 80% of the content which appears on your computer. So just ignore it, and then you are much more freer. Bye-bye. Back to you.
Obrigado. A próxima pergunta é para a Renata. Em que medida os novos modelos econômicos baseados no uso de dados deveriam gerar um bem comum? Ou em que medida os dados que estão disponibilizados na internet por usuários ao redor do mundo podem ser tratados como um bem comum?
It is great that you asked the question, because I'm just writing, it is very interesting how ignorant we are, like in general, like how little popular education is available on the value of data and the potential of data beyond just, it's hidden. The value of data is hidden from the average person eye. And there's a lot of potential in the data, as we have seen with COVID, with the COVID emergency, there's a lot of potential on the data we generate to solve tremendous social problems, but also to enable a lot of social benefits. The municipality of Barcelona had been experimenting, and the municipality of Amsterdam and the municipality of Helsinki, they have been experimenting with very, very creative data commons models. So, for example, if there's a taxi app or many taxi apps operating in your city, what about citizens like a university trying to improve the traffic, or someone trying to improve the access to information for people with a handicap on the schedule of buses with the right platforms, or a business, little business? What about if they could benefit as well of that non-personal data that is relevant for the lives of people? Shall we have a right on that kind of data that is generated from us and from our interactions in public spaces, or from public systems that are operated with our money? The answer is yes, but one of the problems, and that's where the idea of ecosystem comes in, and it is not only data for the sake of data. In parallel with generating the data commons in the cities, in the countries, in specific areas such as education, for example, understanding why and how with remote education some students are doing well and some students are not doing well, and that kind of data shouldn't be privatized. We need to somehow socialize the data centers, and it is different from socializing things that cannot be enjoyed by different people at the same time. Digital has this magic power of the potential of being shared by infinite people at the same time, and being played with by different people at the same time. So I think that. To understand the real value of data, not only the action value, but the potential values that we'll have in different communities, two things need to occur. Not only creative rules to not force, but strongly encourage actors who have this data to share it with others, mandatory rules for certain data to be shared, and also the enablers that you need so people can take advantage of the data. So concrete incentives for small companies and for universities and for communities to use that data and to generate even further data and give it back to the commons to keep it growing. I think that's possible. And that, again, going back to the areas where I think that the Tech New Deal, which is also a Data New Deal, should be piloted. I think that the environmental data is super, super, super important, and also all the data on access to knowledge and education. Environmental data, a concrete example, in the city of Kosovo, and sensors were located and data was captured by citizens, generating data commons on the quality of air. The data gathered by citizens generated profound changes in the quality of air regulation. Similarly, in Barcelona, sensors, like with Raspberry Pis, like the open innovation, were placed in different cities to measure sound pollution, And similarly, specific neighborhoods managed to have better quality of life by forcing with the data, showing the data to the municipality and showing the power of the collective data, improving that they were suffering from sound pollution, and some measures were taken to fix that problem. So those are the very quick examples of bottom-up generation of data by citizens with sensors, with interconnected sensors in a commons pool that change and transform for better the life of people. There's more that we can do. There's infinite possibilities. Needs investment and needs political will, needs organization, and but it is real. And if the private sector, in this multi-stakeholderism that Wolfgang celebrates, opens up their data and contribute to the commons, I think that will unlock infinite possibilities.
Obrigado, Renata. Para finalizar, são duas perguntas, uma para o Wolfgang e outra para a Renata, exemplos concretos. Wolfgang, qual seria um exemplo concreto de soluções tecnológicas que possam fazer prevalecer o interesse público?
On the basic level, it's still the decentralized nature of the internet as we know it, because this enables individuals at the end of the network, this end-to-end communication, to communicate rather freely, to build their own networks, to invent something. So this slogan, innovation without permission, is still an enabling concept, and with all the negative consequences we have seen, this doesn't speak against this principle. But concrete, with regard to the public interest, I think all the discussions we have since a couple of years around the concept of smart cities, where you have sectors now in health, transportation, environment. So here you have technologies, including AI-based solutions, which will contribute to the strengthening of the public interest. The risk is, and this was discussed several times already, is that if this is done between the local authority in cooperation only with the private sector, then this gets a different design. So that means to have the public interest into the design of new technical solutions, I think is very crucial. This is a challenge for the code makers, for standardization organizations. So we have this in the field of privacy, meanwhile, that privacy by design is an accepted concept. So that means even in the IETFs, they are working on protocols to say, okay, we should not allow governments or others, to look into everything what is in your email. So it means I would turn this question into another direction and to say this challenge goes to the standardization bodies, to the code makers. Back to you.
Obrigado, Wolfgang e Renata. Como tornar possível que as necessidades e perspectivas das novas gerações sejam incorporadas na arquitetura da web?
That's that's the importance of public institutions. Again, I'm sorry to keep insisting on that. And I think that UNESCO and ITU play a tremendously important role. I think that we have to fix the internet architecture is broken in many parts, and we haven't been able to fix it. And we have to enable the imagination and the creation of other possibilities. And for that, we need prototypes. And for prototyping different technologies and for prototyping different, policy frames and so on, we need resources, but we also need trust allocated in these multidisciplinary teams that are going to track this. And then after, we need to pilot it. And to pilot possible digital futures, we need collaboration of important players. And I think, and we are going to fail, from 10 possible, for example, structures to fix even the browser. From 10, one maybe is going to work. We need to be very the same way, that everybody is so permissive and so tolerant with Silicon Valley and so many, startups being invested in and dying. The same to fix the big problems of this web architecture. This generation needs the resources and the opportunity to try and fail, and to think big, but to pilot small. So the failure is not that serious, and also the possibility to pilot in different realities. I think that the fact that almost half of humanity is still not connected to the internet give us the opportunity and the possibility to pilot a lot of the solutions in many places from scratch. And it is not experimenting with people. It's not experimenting with the global poor. It's not on the global poor, but with the global poor. You know, like I think that there's still a lot to be done. There's still a lot of needs to be met and a lot to imagine. And the most important is like, this will only be implemented with one thing, is in the design, we need to embed rights. Privacy by design, inclusion by design, is beyond just the privacy by design, inclusion by design, democracy by design in the infrastructure, transparency by design. So these design principles, the internet of the past was not designed following the human rights principles. Some of the things we have to force the regulation, to force the design to respond, and it's not functioning, as we have seen with advertising, for example, digital advertising. So these new technologies, if from scratch, engineers design having human rights principles as design principles coded into the same that code is law, like if the human rights code is coded into the new systems, I think that we will see new technologies emerge. And to give an example, like imagine if all the messaging apps would have been designed with privacy as a principle and with interoperability as a principle. How different the situation will be today. How deconcentrated power would have been. And so that's a concrete example on this. And I think that the entry of 5G technologies presents big challenges, but also big possibilities, because when the internet becomes physical and interconnected objects, new players enter into place, and new regulations from the past need to be updated. And it's a big opportunity to, in parallel with designing new policies, inviting the new generations to the room to design the technology solutions that will fix these problems.
Ok, obrigado, Renata. Quero dizer para vocês, Renata e Wolfgang, que para mim foi um prazer imenso fazer a moderação dessa mesa. Aprendi bastante e tenho absoluta certeza que nós temos a consciência de que nós temos que trazer esse debate e transformar esse debate também em proposições de soluções práticas nos diferentes fóruns dos quais nós participamos. Da minha parte, eu agradeço imensamente essa possibilidade de participação dessa mesa. Agradeço ao Glaser, agradeço ao Nick e também agradeço ao CGI. Passo a palavra, então, para a Luísa e para o Glaser. Muito obrigado, gente.
Oi, Wagner, obrigada. Da nossa parte, a gente faz das suas palavras as nossas. Agradecemos muito o debate, foi extremamente rico de informação e vai nos dar, certamente, muitos subsídios para a gente pensar o futuro da governança da internet, que era o objetivo desse evento, quando a gente construiu o seminário. Muito obrigada, Wolfgang, Renata e Wagner, pela participação de vocês. Foi muito, muito bom. E obrigada a todos que nos acompanharam.
Thank you very much, Renata. Thank you very much, Wolfgang.